Šis mūsu nākamais viesis ir iegūs vairāk nekā 30 gadu pieredzi ārkārtas situāciju un starptautiskās drošības jomās. Arī ievērojumu laiku ir pavadījis iesaistoties NATO operācijās. Un šobrīd viņš konsultē ASV divpusējās programmas, strādājot ar partneriem, lai veidotu noturību. Noturība angliski ir resilience, uzlabotu valsts drošību. Es teiktu, tāds ļoti iespaidīgs viesis. Mēs paskatīsimies, kā mēs varam īstenot civilās aizsardzības uzdevumus tik ļoti mainīgā pasaulē, kā tā ir šobrīd. Tā kā aicināšu skatuves Capacity Building International izpildirektoru un Crisis Lab vadītāju Kyle King. Please welcome! Man vajag, lai jūs pa diviem aplaudējat. Paldies! Welcome, Kyle!
So we'll have to go old school on this. Okay, so thank you very much for being here. I know it's late in the afternoon, and I'm the last presenter before we have our panel discussion, and we sort of move on to the rest of our day. So what I wanted to talk about in this presentation for the next sort of 20 minutes or so is really about the changing nature of civil security and really what this means to the emergency services. Before we get into a larger discussion about that, I just wanted to sort of give a bit of a background about myself before we get started, because I think this is just important in terms of my perspective with emergency services. So I spent 17 years in the fire service in the United States. I left as a chief of operations and training, and I transitioned into a civil advisor for the U.S. Department of Defense, and then also NATO, so a civilian advisor, specifically on the idea of how can emergency services contribute to national security. But I did this through what we call deployed operations. So I spent a couple of years in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo, and others. And so my job at that time was, how do we recover from conflict, and how do you rebuild the fire service? How do you go through and reestablish the institutions, the police departments? How do you build an exercise program, a national level exercise program? These different aspects, which was not traditional to what we are typically used to when we are in the emergency services in our own country. So as that transitioned, after those sort of gone through that 30 years, that includes 17 years in the emergency services, deployed operations, and then also now supporting NATO in terms of implementing resilience. Resilience is a broad word. It means a lot, and it means nothing all at the same time, so we have to define it. And so that's where NATO is working very hard with allies to define resilience and then to be able to implement that through and including civil protection. So my current focus right now is community resilience as a contributor to national security. What does it mean, for example, for the city of Riga, for our other cities that we live in our municipalities, and how do we contribute to security? But before we get into much detail, I wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about the past, because we have come a very long way. Of course, I'm referencing just the United States here in these couple of images, but the civil protection area and the fire service has grown tremendously since the 1970s. If we take a look at the past and how far we've come, we've seen the evolution of civil security from the 1970s to present. And really, we have had a chance to develop milestones in how we deliver the service. We've had the opportunities to professionalize the service over the last 30 years. It's become more standardized. The training and the equipping has become more complex, more technical. And we've been able to optimize every aspect of our service delivery down to the number of trucks, the number of people, the amount of water required. We know our percentages of water capacities on high peak periods and low periods. We know building construction and standards. We've had innovations in structural design and development and urban planning, like our last presenter was talking about. The technologies are advancing, and during this past, we've been having advancements in public safety measurements. So we've We've looked at integrated planning. We've looked at the way our communities respond. We've had the ability to mature and professionalize the services since the last 20 or 30 years. We've seen the technological milestones. As you could see in the conference, the personal protective equipment, how that's advancing over the years. We're getting better with the technology in terms of infrared cameras, thermal, and then being able to look at the exterior buildings and have just sort of the type of support that we need to improve life safety but increase our response capabilities. And so we've been able to progress over the last 20, 30 years and really become a professionalized service and to be able to develop a unique civilian capability to manage crisis. And that is what I largely contribute to, what I call the peace dividend, right? So that's coming out of sort of my background with the emergency services, but now we start to look at this through a different lens, which is the peace dividend. And so the peace dividend was that era of time after sort of World War II, moving past the Cold War, and then to the era we're in now, of where we've had substantial peace and prosperity. There's been the economic prosperity, the growth of our nations, and the changes in the way that we operate, and the implementation of more democratic norms and standards, the rule of law and other aspects. But this period of time and quiet allowed us to master our abilities. It allowed us to master our skill sets, to become very good at saving lives and property. We also developed a comprehensive approach, meaning that when we look across the spectrum of civil protection, we, of course, we're looking at the prevention, mitigation, we're looking at preparedness, response, recovery, and we're looking at all these phases of emergency management, and we have now instituted these specific phases in how we manage a crisis. We've done this collectively. And we've done this collectively with law enforcement, with emergency medicine, with the fire service, and we all have our defined domains. We have our legislation, our rules, our procedures, and our standard operating procedures that we implement within our departments and municipalities. And what that means for us is that we've been investing in effective service delivery. How can we get better? And because we've had the peacetime dividend in space and time to think about this, we've only begun to refine the service and make it more appropriate, which means there's significant value in having the time and the space to do this without any external pressures. We've had distinct operations, but yet we'd had shared goals, which means we all serve the public, we all serve our communities. But at the same time, rule of law, law enforcement is one thing, fire protection and search and rescue is something different. These are distinct domains that are tied to specific, distinct departments and capabilities. Financial prudence is a thing that has been characterized now in this peace dividend, which means we've had to fight for dollars and fight for euros, fight for the ability to buy a new fire truck, to increase staffing, to increase capabilities. There was a question on another presentation panel earlier today, which was, how do you know how much to invest in a program like business continuity? It's a difficult question. When is there too much fire service? When is there too much police departments? So this area of peace we've had over the last 20 to 30 years has been at a point of where we've had to refine our budgets, refine our expenditures, and still try to maintain a service that the public requires. But there has been increasing pressures because it's a cost, right? We used to have a saying in the United States with the fire service that you're a bit like an insurance policy, right? You never really produce money for the city. It's always going to be an expenditure. And we've had defined duties. There's very clear roles and responsibilities in the way that we operate. And this is often legislated and regulated. It's in our exercises and our procedures. And information sharing during this period of time was based on the need to know. It was based on the idea that while we're building out information and or intelligence, if you didn't need to know or it wasn't important to you, it's not your business, and that is compartmentalized. And so we've effectively have created information domains that are unique for every agency. But the future is really something quite different. The future, from all these discussions that I've had sort of with different nations, within NATO, my experiences coming out of conflict areas, is that we're simply not really ready. That peace dividend has been a wonderful time, but that is quickly coming to an end. And so what that means is we are entering into a dawn of what I would call a continuous crisis. And we're starting to see that. Crisis is becoming the norm and not the exception. It's something that we're dealing with on a daily basis, multiple times during the day, and it's going to be done through various different domains, not even just ours. So we have to really start decoding what it means to be in a polycrisis environment, and we'll talk a little bit more about this word in a couple of minutes here. But we have to really start unpacking and determining what that means for us, because we are going to be increasingly affected by complex crisis every day of every week. So there's been presentations on cyber, artificial intelligence, techniques in more effective fire prevention and technologies. But we've also seen that nations are now starting to warm up to the idea that something is coming, that the future is a lot more complex than what we are in today. You've seen statements from nations in your part of the area, in Europe as well, and you've also seen it from the EU, and you also see it from NATO. There's an acknowledgement openly that we are entering into a period of time that's going to be more complex than what it is today. There's also a level of sub-warfare tensions that are escalating amongst nations. So we start to see that we are below the threshold of warfare, but things are getting increasingly complicated, and we're starting to see cyber attacks, the Baltic Sea issues and underlying sea cables, communication cables, the attacks on the Red Sea, affecting communication lines, shipping lanes, supply chain dynamics. And in effect, what this really means for us in an era of complex crisis is the fact that the pace of change is moving faster than what we can deal with in terms of the culture. So it's outpacing our ability to change as a culture. And so another question we had from a moderator, I think it was in this room, but how do you get, when they came out with the seatbelts and the regulations about seatbelts and people don't want to wear them, how do you change that culture of preparedness? And so really this is the change that's coming in front of us with complex crisis is going to outpace that ability to change the way our societies think. So if we were to look at this a little bit more, we'd want to define what is a polycrisis, and you may have heard this word before, and just for the use of this particular discussion for us, and what I think it should be defined as, is really something that is a simultaneous occurrence and interaction of multiple crises. So this is across multiple domains, and they're interconnected. Across various domains, creating a complex series of challenges. And connected series of challenges. And so when we do this, or we look at this now from a national security or national level planning perspective, we are looking at, there's various different domains. The political, the military, the economic domains, the social domains, information, infrastructure, a lot of what we talked about. But the key points I wanted to highlight here before we move forward into some graphs is the fact that this is multiple crises across multiple domains. They are interdependent. So while you're responding to a large industrial fire, and a cyber attack might take down your communications, you might have evacuations that are happening, and external pressures. These are systemic risks. That industrial plant might be absolutely involved in food security or in water security. And these are interdependent. And so we now have supply chains and systems that are so connected because of that peacetime dividend that if one breaks, we start to see this domino effect that happens across our society. So polycrisis is a bit of a buzzword, I acknowledge that, but it was really coming out sort of in 1999 with a book that was published, but it gained some new notoriety in I think it was in 2022, when it came out from the World Economic Forum, and there was a report published in Davos, and they essentially included this chart inside of it, which says, this is everything that we're facing. Now, if you're in the emergency services, I would point your attention towards the square on the screen, because that's where we're looking at natural disasters. That's our wildfires, structural fires, things like that. But you can see we're living in a domain of where we are connected and affected by everything else that's included inside there. So while that is where we are on our normal day-to-day business, these long-term effects will have an impact in the way that we operate. If we have economic issues, the city's ability to pay salaries, the city's ability to refurbish equipment, to buy new trucks, to build out capabilities, are all impacted by this. And that's one thing that I wanted to highlight, and one of our speakers mentioned it as well in terms of one of the first discussions this morning. This is a systemic problem. This is an interconnected problem. The era of polycrisis means that as one grows, the others are impacted. But if we have a more academic view of what it means in terms of NATO resilience, this is sort of an academic view. Now, this chart was developed as part of an academic study with NATO's guidelines coming out that each nation has received, and they are looking at this in terms of what objectives and guidelines should we do as allies to have a more secure society, more societal resilience. And so they did this study, and it was based off the information from the strategic resilience concept. And I want to use this chart because it not only mirrors some of the efforts that we have in the emergency services, but it also is showing you a glimpse inside the way that they think. So there's 4 categories there in terms of prepare, absorb, recover, and adapt. Now, in terms of this chart, the most important thing for NATO was to realize that a threat was coming along this line of capability, which is a national capability. Realize the threat was going to happen, and so prepare. Then the threat would happen. We would take and absorb that impact, and then we would grow and we would recover from that and increase our capability over time. So if you look at the top left corner there, you'll see that the academic view of this is that we would increase our capability over time, and it would always be a net positive. But in reality, what's happening is nothing captures culture. A culture of preparedness, a culture of safety. That's not captured within this slide. So with the ability to change the way that our societies operate, the ability to have an impact and improve safety conditions, not only in the workforce, but in our communities. How is that happening? And that's something that is very difficult to capture. But I would draw your attention to this. So if you're coming out of the emergency services, you probably understand that there's phases of emergency management, and we have prevention, preparedness, we have response, and we have recovery, and we have mitigation. This is a typical phased layout in the United States in terms of emergency management and responding to large-scale disasters. And so now we have NATO's vision and their phases, and then we have our, like a fairly standard model of like the phases of emergency management overlaid on top of that. But I want to focus in on one specific area right here, because to me, this is a problem area. The assumption that we always get better. And so if that's the problem area, I just want to say, recall what we were talking about in terms of the peace dividend. It was an era of time and peace and freedom and space to grow, to become more professional, to refine not only our budgets, but our people and our services. So we had time and space and no pressure to necessarily change rapidly. But if we take a closer look at this, and what we start to see is that it's not, in the era of a polycrisis, in the era of turbulence, is another term that people are using. It's not just one thing. It's going to be ships dragging their anchors in the Baltic Sea. It's going to be lack of communication lines. It's going to be GPS jamming in the region. It's going to be continuous daily fires that you're having to respond to and put out. And it's going to be large-scale events. And so we start to see continuous polycrisis events happening in the future, which means our recovery is not perfect. Our recovery is going to go up and down. And our recovery is going to improve in some areas and go down in others. If we lose one fire truck, that's 300,000 euros, which is not planned for in a budget, and will take 2 years to replace. Recovery is not linear, is the point that I'm saying. And when you're working in the emergency services and you're looking at effective service delivery, you have to also consider the equipment, the personnel, and the ability to deal or deliver your service to the public. One key point that I see here is that we are going to be affected by a multitude of threats that are not within our capabilities to deal with them. So again, as I mentioned, underwater sea cables, GPS jamming, and coming back to sort of the experience of where I've been, where I start to see real issues is on that downward slope in that curve. Because on that downward slope and curve, you start to enter into an area of not being able to recover and getting into instability. And instability at a society level then creates further problems. So what does that mean? What does all that mean, and so what, right? So why should you care about that? Because this is really about an evolution, it's not a revolution. There's nothing that you can do dramatically today to improve tomorrow. This is going to take an investment of incremental changes over time to change the culture. To change the culture of preparedness that we have built from the 70s forward, and then into a culture of what I call civilian readiness. And I say that because we need to really look at localized application of both of disasters, because the local community is always impacted first. So the localized application of what this means at a community level, both from disasters and conflict, are essentially the same. And we also have to identify our most effective practices. We have to audit what is working absolutely the best for us right now, and then start really working on more of that in the future. It requires proactive outreach, and it requires more, dare I say, marketing capabilities. We have to convince the public that they are now part of the solution and not just a customer. It requires civil society engagement and the integration of civil society organizations to be able to help us effectively respond. You'll see a lot more emphasis these days on public-private partnership across the alliance, because the fact that this has become known as most of the telecommunication and infrastructure and critical infrastructure is in the private sector in many countries. So there has to be a relationship. We need to go into community-based risk assessments. So we've gone from a macro level problem on potential instability, and now we're going down into a micro level application of how can we start resolving some of these issues. And that comes back down to the community. So what is the risk assessment to the community? How can we help build community capabilities to respond and to be able to manage any type of response and ensure their own safety? That also means we have to be open to dialogue. We have to be comfortable with difficult conversations. I've been in many conversations where you're serving the community and they say, we pay for your service through our tax dollars. Why should you do this? We don't want to pay more for this. You have to be comfortable in those conversations, and these are difficult conversations to have because we will not escape them. And so we have to also have expectation management. This was something that we've seen coming out of the United States more recently. We have large insurance mechanisms for our buildings. But if you live in the state of California, there's so many wildfires and forest fires that the insurance companies will now say, we're not paying for anything, and they leave. And so that is one of our risk mitigation measures that we've had as a culture for 40, 50 years is now gone. So then we have to start really setting expectations. And in the emergency services, how do you set expectations with the public if they expect you to be there in 6 minutes, 8 minutes, and it takes you 30 minutes, an hour? Because you have increasingly complex crises pulling on the same resources that were used during this era of peace. And that comes also down to risk planning and integration with civil societies. I used to have an old boss who would say, we need to widen the circle of responsibility. And one of the ways forward that I see is incorporating civil societies in our risk management and planning, having them be a contributing partner and a part of that conversation so they understand the shared responsibilities that we have to deal with at a community level. Community capability metrics. And so if we're working in a community of a certain size, we should understand as a planner and emergency services how much communities can contribute. Can they mobilize volunteers? If so, how many? 10, 5, 50? We need to understand community capabilities, because if we don't understand community capabilities, then we actually end up into a place where it's like a double microphone or something. We actually end up into a place where we, it works now. Thank you. So we want to understand community capabilities. So if you're talking to the defense side, they're going to say, we can't integrate the civilian side because we don't know what they can do. And then you have the civilian side that says, we want to help, but nobody's telling us how. So two fundamental problems that are rather easy to solve, but what we have to do is to work with the communities and civil society organizations to say, as a fire service or as a police service, and we have a major disaster, our expectations are that you are going to provide food, water, shelter, volunteers, capabilities, and that has to be exercised and agreed and practiced. Because then you can start with integrated planning. Then you can start building trust, building performance, and start building a real community capability. And we have to shift a narrative here, the narrative of sort of ownership of community sustainability. You will face a time, we will all face a time where communities have to take responsibilities for themselves. As I mentioned with the fire issues in California, we've also seen from FEMA, which is our national level emergency management agency, that there's been this slow walk backwards to you will have support in 24 hours, to you will have support in 48 hours, and then you will have support in maybe a week. So they're reducing the national level obligation because of complex crisis and resource constraints, and the communities need to be able to pick up this responsibility. Individual households have to be prepared not for 24 hours, 72 hours, maybe 1 week now. And so it's constantly being walked back, which means we need to emphasize not individual responsibility, but collective community responsibility. We need to have a better adaptation of systems thinking. Also, I think that was mentioned at least twice today. Adaptation in systems thinking and understanding complex problems that we're facing. How are we impacted by cyber attacks? And that also takes a community-based approach. In the United States, I know of at least one alliance that's being formed in a community where they're taking private sector, universities, military industry, and then they're bringing that together into an association that can work on cyber domain issues. And we have to really enhance cross-domain learning. Because the peace dividend, we all live within our own stovepipe. And what I've seen in many countries I've worked in is that we don't talk to each other. So that interagency communication and that community to institution communication needs to be improved. And we have to really commit to this being a multi-year journey. This is going to be a strategy that has to change, and a strategy that has to be implemented if we want to create change. And the central theme that I'll sort of leave you with is that this is about civilian readiness. So if any of you have come from sort of that military environment, you'll understand that there's a concept of military readiness. We can generate forces, we can organize them, we can train them, we can equip them, and we can deploy them, and they can execute a mission, and we are ready to do that. We don't have a conceptual version of that in the civilian community. You have something similar to that through structured emergency services and police capability and institutional capability, but not at a community capability level. So we need to not only increase the civilian preparedness to sustain themselves for 72 hours, but the willingness to take responsibility at a community level for when the fire service doesn't show up for 4 days, 5 days, 1 week, because other things are happening, because there's a flood, because there's a population movement evacuation event happening. There's a large-scale event somewhere. And so we need to increase civilian readiness and the willingness to be able to respond and support our efforts in the emergency services, and thereby, by proxy, be able to increase our own national security. A lot of this you will see coming out of sort of the world events you're seeing today. If you're interested, you can go and you can take a look. Just go look for NATO resilience baselines, and Google those terms, and you'll start to see that there's a lot of interest going in this direction about how do we increase societal resilience. Because we've seen what's happening in Ukraine, everybody has seen it, and now we're looking at the impact of what communities can and cannot do, and how that actually contributes to overall national security. So with that, I'll just leave you with that today. Thank you very much for your time. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. King. Thank you. I guess a lot of questions will come during the discussion, but one question. You were talking about resilience. I have a feeling that we are somehow too comfortably numb in Western society. We've been living in comfort and security for so long that we somehow can't believe that we are in danger. Mm-hmm. Is that true feeling, or is it just a perception?
No, I think that perception is out there. I think because we've come through this peace dividend era and we've had this period of time and space to focus on effective service delivery and building up the fire service, we've created a culture of comfort, right? And I think that is coming into an era where that's starting to slowly close. So we're seeing increased sort of sub-warfare level of activity from cyber domain and everything else, the GPS jamming that you're seeing, that is eventually going to create friction. It's going to create discomfort in our communities. It's going to happen.
When? Where's the threshold?
It's already happening. And so you can see that by statements coming out from Sweden, Norway, the EU presidency, like, Poland. There is something coming. We need to start being prepared. And I think that as emergency services, we need to start looking at that more proactively until it becomes a moment of where we need to respond to this and our communities are not prepared. But it requires a heavy investment in messaging, changing this culture I think you've mentioned before, which was already difficult to get where we are. Now we need to take the next step.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. A little certificate and also a picture, please.